In the last video lecture, we talked about the development of agrarian culture and then the beginnings of industrial culture and the making of the people of the villages landless and turning them into labor, paid labor, and the beginnings of a labor market instead of communities of exchange and communities of support. So the result of this was a huge dislocation of people in the countries that were industrializing first, France, Germany, and England. Now we see this dislocation still happening in countries that are industrializing. So countries that were very agrarian 20 years ago and are now shifting their population to cities are experiencing much of the same disruption. Land is being taken and used in another way, and families are being torn apart. NAFTA, the North American trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, took people from the land. It redefined land holding in Mexico so that it was no longer the traditional family that controlled their own land. It made land something that could be bought and sold. And so people were pushed into a situation where they sold their land. And millions of Mexicans became landless in the last 20 years. And they moved to Mexico City and Guadalajara and to Houston and Los Angeles. And this enormous shift from an agrarian people to a new industrialized people, we are seeing as we live in America these very days. So I want to talk about the response in England to this building of the new industrial state. In 1601, Parliament in England passed something called the Elizabethan Poor Law. And this was the first time that a national government had taken legislative responsibility for the poor. And it said that the government was responsible for the well-being of the poor, these people who are pushed off the land. But there were some conditions. The first condition is you could only receive help in your own community. We call this settlement. So if you went someplace else looking for work, you could receive no benefits at all. But if you stayed in your community, you had a claim on some form of benefits. The second thing was that your first stop had to be your own family. And the family had to be had to shape up and try and support these people who've fallen into poverty. If the family couldn't, then we created two categories of the poor. There were the worthy poor, widows and orphans, women whose husbands had died, children whose fathers had died, whose parents had died. They were considered the worthy poor. The blind. We've always had a soft spot in our hearts as a civilization for people that are blind. And so we've given them special benefits. And those who are unable to work because of no fault of their own. So people who had significant disabilities and were unable to work. And to some extent, the elderly, if they had worked. And so these folks were the worthy poor, and they were given what was called outdoor relief, which means that they were given enough food and enough coal to live in their cottage, not to live particularly well, but to live and survive in their cottage and be able to get by. And so this is a form of in-kind relief, which has sometimes turned into cash relief so people can go and buy it themselves, but that allowed people to live in their own homes. The other category was the people that we considered the unworthy poor. These are the demon-possessed, the mentally ill, and the developmentally disabled, those with untreated autism. It was thought in that time, where there was basically no science of psychology, that people who acted in these very unexpected and apparently bizarre ways were inhabited by demons, and therefore they were sinners, and they were amongst the unworthy poor. And then there were what were called wanton women, women who had children out of marriage, and their children were called bastards, unmarried mothers and their children. And they were considered the unworthy poor because they had broken the moral statutes and of the society, and they were now a burden on the society. So certain orphans who weren't working for their own living or had been dumped on the society by parents who weren't taking responsibility. And then amongst the unworthy poor were criminals, drunks, and people who had no place else to go. These unworthy poor were offered help, but that was in an institution, something called a poorhouse. They were all living in a cramped space. They were fed out of buckets, whatever happened to be around to feed. There was no idea of sanitation. These places were dirty. So take a room that is 30 by 30 and put 100 people in it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, some of whom are significantly mentally ill, some of whom are developmentally disabled in ways that make them quite incapacitated. Some of them are young mothers and their children. Some of them are criminals. Some of them are drunks, all living in the same space. And there was forced labor, because if you weren't going to do the right thing, we were going to give you support only if you worked. So there was a limited diet. There's a famous story of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, which starts with the young man in a poorhouse, and he asked the owner for more food. And the owner said, "More? You want more?" It was unheard of to speak up like that. So these poorhouses were often privatized, given over to contractors who had the incentive to run them at the lowest possible cost. So this is a picture, a caricature of what a poorhouse looked like. You'll see the man being beaten. You'll see them using their mallets to beat hay. You'll see them pulling the junk out of food that they're later going to eat. You see people chained to the wall, hung from the ceiling. These were really awful places to live. And the purpose of making them awful was to create incentives for people to do what were considered the right thing. So in the next video lecture, we're going to talk about the poorhouse as it comes to America, as the Americans come, as the European Americans arrive and set up communities in the United States.